Okay, so welcome to my talk. This presentation is very much still in the works. This is part of a manuscript that I've just recently finished. It's now under internal review with my university because I want to make sure it has the best shot before I send it off to a journal. So what that means is there's still a lot of room for people's feedback on this. If you listen to this and you have thoughts or questions about that, I'd be very interested in hearing those out. But this particular presentation is now attempting to map out, explore, start a conversation about looking at gender and the animal rights movement beyond the binary. And I have a few goals with this presentation. I'm hoping that we can delve into vegan feminist theory and push it beyond just looking at women and the traditional understanding of what women are, and also pull more from critical queer Black feminist theory, which a lot of vegan feminist theory already does. But in this presentation, I'm going to pay a little bit more attention to that. And I also want to be thinking about multi-species oppression and liberation, of course, not just what happens to people active in the animal rights movement, but how is that related to what happens to non-human animals and how we understand non-human animals. So this really is about beginning a dialogue. This is something that I think there's a few other people who are doing this kind of work, but looking specifically in animal rights mobilization spaces, we don't really have a lot going on there. So this is really starting up at a dialogue. And hopefully then we can consider how we can push forward in the animal rights movement with a more multi-species consciousness as sort of an element of a multi-species solidarity, if you will. So just a very, very brief history on the role of gender non-conforming people in social justice spaces. There's tons of books on this. I don't have a lot of time to go through them all, but just very quickly, historically, trans people, non-binary people have been excluded from other leftist movements, including the lesbian gay movement. It was only in recent decades that those groups were actually acknowledged. It was seen as something secondary to gay and lesbian activism. The feminist movement has notoriously excluded non-binary folks and trans people. That's a debate that continues today. And this is problematic because there are a lot of very specific issues that face people who are gender non-conforming that need to be addressed. And those could include homelessness, particular issues with medical access, job security, being disproportionately incarcerated or harassed by the police, and of course, assault and homicide as well. So it's a very vulnerable group, and it really does matter for social movements to pay attention and open up that circle of concern for people who don't fit in the binary. So these movements are a lot more inclusive today, but what about the animal rights movement? Well, I would argue that we don't really know very much about it, and that's kind of one of the reasons I wanted to do this study. A few years ago, I did a survey of 300 American vegans, and I was specifically looking for information on politics and stuff like that. But just in the demographics, I found a lot of interesting stuff. For instance, most of them were atheists. But the other thing I found was a big old chunk of people, Mishka's done, sorry, goodbye. A big old chunk of people chose not to disclose their gender. So they had the option. I wanted to make sure it was inclusive. So instead of having to choose one of the boxes, I left the box empty and people could type in what they wanted. And almost half people chose not to type anything, which I thought was really interesting. What were people trying to say there? And then of those who did type in there, about 1% of my sample said that they were non-binary. So I said, okay, there's something going on here with gender that I think is worth exploring. And the animal rights movement has, as we know, as practicing feminists, has really had some issues with feminist inclusion. Well, it definitely hasn't done very much as far as gender diversity beyond the binary. When I'm doing some preliminary research, like what was going on, I mean, I was alive when this stuff was happening, but I don't really remember hearing about this gender inclusivity beyond the binary very much at all. I mean, I was pretty much active in the animal rights movement online every day. But apparently, back in 2017, PETA put out one of its famous I'd rather go naked than anti-fur ads featuring trans models. And that was supposed to be like, wow, really groundbreaking. And to an extent, yeah, it is. But one could also argue this is still part of that sort of trans as public spectacle where bodies have to be made, private spaces have to be made public as part of this trans experience. And obviously we know the history of PETA very much so about that spectacle. And so I do wonder if it was a bit condescending the way they put trans people on this this campaign ad. Who's to say? But anyway, PETA has a long history of body shaming and gender policing, so there's reason to question that. There are some publications that are out there on gender diversity, especially for gender nonconforming folks. It's really an up-and-coming scholarship area of scholarship. Definitely Queer and Trans Voices by Bruick and McNeil. This is a really useful one. It's a very approachable book, and they basically make the argument that gender diverse or the gendered experience has a lot of parallels, of course, with non-human experiences, and beyond that, lots of marginalized experiences, of course, intersect, which we've been talking about today, and very much so rooted in white supremacism, patriarchy, systems of colonialism as well. So there's a lot of sort of historical connectedness there. They also highlight this forced conformity, like you either must be this or you must be that. So subjugation as well, and manufactured binaries. So especially with the coming of colonialism, a lot of that categorization and binary work was instituted. So of course that has implications not just for animals, but for people who have gender identities that don't fit into these constructed boxes. Greta Gard has also written quite a bit on this. And another point for consideration is, how does this actually interrogate these social constructions of what is considered to be natural? So I've also pulled on some Black feminist work, as I mentioned I was going to do. I don't have a lot of time to delve into this, but I can recommend the work of Charlene Carruthers, basically making the argument that queer Black vegan, sorry, not queer Black vegan, this queer feminist vegan. I just want to say vegan, it's not vegan. She's just in the Black queer movement, and really in the Black civil rights movement as a queer woman. There we go, got it out there. But basically saying that embodying all these different intersections puts her in a particularly awkward place. She talks about her experiences as things that she recognizes as important, and how she gets bullied quite a lot and picked on when she enters leadership positions. And so there's this intersectional failure there that she describes. And I think a lot of that can actually be applied to the animal rights movement. She says, this stuff kills our movement. And I would argue this stuff has the potential to kill the animal rights movement as well. Audre Lorde has also done a lot of work on this, as another queer Black feminist doing amazing work around this concept of difference, saying that we do need community. It is important for us to come together, that sense of solidarity is important for a movement, but by no means is that an invitation for us to leave our differences at the door, because difference actually, according to Lorde, is something to be celebrated. It can be a point of power. But unfortunately, what happens within social movements is these differences become sources of infighting and sources of exclusion. And this idea of divide and conquer actually infiltrates our movement to weaken us. And so Lorde asks us to actually look at difference as something that is strategic, that is empowering, and not something that should be hidden or denied. So this leads me to my research. I wanted to just see what was going on there and what people thought, because, you know, full disclosure, I'm a gender conforming person. I'm not non-binary. So there's obviously different things about living as an activist in the animal rights movement that I wouldn't be aware of. So I put this survey out there and just asked people to respond to see, you know, what they thought. Basically, I was hoping to get 30 people. I advertise it really heavily on Facebook and Twitter. And eventually I just had to call it quits because I just did not get the numbers I wanted, and I needed to move on with the study. I was asking about, obviously, gender, also race, age, where they live, what kind of activism they engaged with. And then the questions relevant to the study, it was basically just asking, you know, what's it like to be a gender nonconforming person in the animal rights movement? And do you think that there's connections between what happens to animals and what you experience? So at the end of the day, I got 16 people to respond. I had 19, but they didn't meet all of the requirements. So it's a small sample. We'd like to see more people involved, but this is a good starting point. And had a good mix of people as far as gender identities. However, most people were white, and it's skewed towards being younger people, which might make sense because younger people today, grown up in a society that's a little bit more welcoming to express gender difference. This was also quite Western. Most of these people were all coming from Europe or the United States. Most of them were pretty literate when it came to recognizing their relationship as a non-conforming person and as an activist, and what happens with non-human animals. all but 2 of them thought that their gender identity informed their activism. So they're drawing on this. So this is what Lord was arguing. They're drawing on this sense of difference, and it informs their activism. The 2 people were worried about achieving mutual equality and respect. So they recognize that shared oppression. 2 people were also aware of how this is socially constructed, this idea of gender and this idea of species. Quite a few people were also pulling that, or 2 people rather, were pulling it into this notion of hierarchical thinking. So really sophisticated in a way. This also makes me question the bias potential in my study. Some pretty sophisticated responses. People are like pretty well read on feminist theory. Some people even reported that they saw how non-human animals were referred to as it, and they had experienced being called it as well. So that objectification. Another person said that just by being a person who's non-binary, that they experience greater empathy for what happens with other animals. Looking at what happens to people who are gender non-conforming in the animal rights movement, so not just their personal consciousness, but what's their experience in the movement and interactions with others, they were quite divided. Quite a lot of them said, yeah, I've experienced discrimination as a gender non-conforming person, but 6 of them said they had not. However, 2 people said they had not, but also knew that it happened to other people. And 2 people said that they disengaged from the movement because they didn't want to be around that kind of stuff. So that's something that we should be really aware of then, as for people who are involved in social movement organizing, the animal rights movement specifically. Are we alienating people from the movement by not taking these issues seriously? So they were dealing with stuff like misgendering, being dismissed as though being outside the binary wasn't real. And just basically putting up with a lot of, ugliness. Sorry, Mishka's getting excited. Mishka, this is also about you. Mishka's intersex. So yeah, there was overall amongst the participants an unease about the movement's inability to talk about non-binary realities, the inability to provide safe spaces, to offer mutual respect, or to even engage in any kind of respectful conversation and acknowledgement of non-binary life. So there's a lot of discomfort and frustration. One respondent said that they'd been rebuffed with this idea that this talking about being trans or non-binary hurts the cause. We need to focus on animals. Some also were worried about how is this even consistent with the vegan logic. So this one participant said that how can you be transphobic and also call yourself a vegan, because trans people are also animals. So what can we learn from this? I think that people who are outside the binary have a really sophisticated understanding of fairness and how this is important as a social movement strategy, which again is consistent with Black queer feminist work. And some people are saying we need to actively move out and make alliances with other movements. We have to practice consistency in our logic as far as our ethics and our goals. We can't on one hand say we want a peaceful world for other animals, and then on the other hand, be ugly and discriminatory towards people who don't fit the traditional gender binary. There's also a few people who mentioned the problem of white male centrism in the animal rights movement as perhaps a reason for this discrimination or dismissiveness. And don't have time to read through all of that, but I'll have the slides up on my website later for people who want to look at this. And of course, one day, the article will be out there. So just as I wrap up, some limitations with this study. Obviously, it was a very small sample, but I was excited to even get the number that I did. I think it gives us a good jumping off point. Obviously, it was very skewed towards a white experience. People who are non-binary and also non-white, they experience a whole nother level of discrimination, lack of acceptance, lack of visibility. The surveys also were done digitally. I wonder if I could have got different responses if I'd done face-to-face, although, like I said, I got quite sophisticated responses from the survey. I wonder if Facebook and Twitter maybe added some bias to this study. I wonder if I don't know, but I wonder if I got quite a lot of academic people, and that's why I got such high level thinking about, not to dismiss activists. A lot of activists, they are pretty woke with the high level feminist theory for sure. But I also wonder if there's selection bias related to where people are more likely to be academic. They're already in the know about these issues. And then people maybe have really crappy experiences are more likely to respond to this. And then people who've had such crappy experiences that they aren't even in the movement, would they have even seen a notice about the survey? So we don't even know about their experiences. So yeah, we saw from this preliminary study then that people outside the binary, they're very conscious to the connection between being a non-binary or trans person, gender fluid person, and what happens with non-human animals in our society. They're aware of that connection. They're divided on discrimination in the movement. Some people said, yes, it's there. Some people said, no, they've not seen it. And then there's some people in between who've not experienced it, but know other people who have. And that's cause for concern, because I would like to see like 0 people saying that they've experienced discrimination about being trans, non-binary, genderqueer, gender fluid, because it's unacceptable. So yeah, it's logically problematic that we have this marginalization of our activists based on gender identity and then claim to be anti-oppression activists. So I think perhaps the genderqueer community could be a key demographic to mobilize, because they've got a lot of information here. They've got a really sophisticated consciousness to how oppression works. I think also delving back into queer Black feminist theory can offer us a lot more insight on how to manage difference while also building solidarity and alliances across movements. So how can we make more space for queer folks, genderqueer folks, and support them and listen to them? So more studies like this to draw on that wisdom and platform their issues. That's all.
Okay, I hope it's visible. I just tried to make it bigger, all right? So hi, so I'm my name is Kadri Aavik, and I'm a vegan sociologist in Estonia, trying to do vegan sociology in the neoliberal academia, and where vegan sociology and vegan studies are very, very marginalized. And so I wanted to today share with you some of the kind of challenges or questions that I have had myself, trying to use intersectionality in my own research, and specifically kind of like methodological questions that came up, for me. And maybe I'm not really providing any definitive answers, because, these are very complex issues, but more like I'm raising some questions and maybe opening up some discussion. Okay, so definitely, of course, intersectionality has become such a widely used approach and term in research, and also in vegan and studies and critical animal studies. And often, that's kind of my experience, I kind of see that it's often used superficially, and maybe it's not like clearly defined, or maybe people are not saying what they mean by it, or what kind of approach to intersectionality people use. And so I thought, if we kind of think it more through kind of more, and how we use intersectionality, and we can use its analytical strengths, and we can move towards a more nuanced analysis of veganism and human-animal relations, and kind of better understand power relations and inequalities. And definitely intersectionality, using it in vegan sociology, we can use it to challenge the anthropocentric nature of existing intersectional frameworks and bring in animals. And of course, in sociology, method is like a very important thing for us, and we can kind of, I think this is our strength. We can develop intersectionality as a method. So yeah, so kind of like just raising here some questions to think about when using intersectionality, and kind of some reflections based on my own research, and I do qualitative research. Okay. Right, so actually one issue is a broader kind of conceptual issue. So what intersectionality is, and so basically these different approaches that are that exist and are available. So they come with particular assumptions and histories and baggage, So for instance, we've got this one of the probably the most prominent approach, by Black feminist and critical race scholars that actually. And this is how it originated too. So it focused on gender, race, and class mainly, and their intersections. And really importantly, anti-racist politics is at the core of this analysis. So it's really key there. And then, of course, there are some other approaches that are committed to social justice more broadly, and think of intersectionality as a kind of critical inquiry and praxis. So not simply like a method for doing research, but it's actually a tool to empower people. So that aligns really well with that first one. But also intersectionality has been used a kind of just as a theoretical or methodological tool to analyze any kind of intersections, and including, experiences of privileged people and groups. And some of those approaches do not necessarily challenge racism or white privilege. And there's a danger here that they can become apolitical. So maybe in some of this research, notice more that intersectionality is a kind of buzzword and it's kind of there, but I don't know, like, what does it do there, and what is it used for? Maybe sometimes unclear. So basically, if we just take intersectionality and try to use it as some kind of finished framework without reflecting on its origins and kind of particular features, that might be quite problematic. And it really matters also in which context we do our research. So kind of social, cultural, geographic context, because these power relations in these contexts obviously differ and are quite particular. And for instance, like these social categories that we focus on can have different meanings, somewhat different meanings in different places. For instance, the categories of race and whiteness are quite specific in different places. For instance, I'm kind of based in this northeastern Europe and this post-socialist area. So definitely kind of whiteness has a bit different meanings here that it has in the US, for instance. So I think these are kind of important things to just consider. And then, when I was kind of I've been trying to use intersectionality, thinking of it as a method, it's kind of tricky because there are very few very specific guidelines like how to use it as a method, and of course this lack of this partly comes from these different traditions and histories of intersectionality. And of course it also depends on what kind of empirical material we use. For instance, do we analyze kind of personal narratives that we collect through interviews, or maybe some policy documents? So these are very different kinds of materials, empirical material that maybe we need to have a little bit different approach. And obviously, as sociologists, we are always dealing with these different levels of analysis. And here too, whether we analyze intersectionality on the kind of micro individual level, or we look at the macro level. So this kind of it requires a bit different approaches, but obviously those levels are very interlinked. So basically one of the issues is what I found difficult is how to determine kind of what kind of intersections matter in the context of the particular topic that I study and the kind of empirical material that I have, and how to also identify those social categories and their intersections. And so this is actually one of the key tasks of a researcher, I think, who studies intersectionality. So how do we make those categories, like how do we identify them actually and analyze them? And maybe, so I just will share a little bit my experience on using intersectionality to become like more concrete here. And so I did some qualitative research and used the narrative method. And this is a recent book that came out that I wrote, and this focused on vegan men and understanding the lived experiences of vegan men. And I tried to use intersectionality throughout my analysis, throughout the book. And I guess a couple of issues here that came up, as I talked about the intersectionality and its particular history being very importantly kind of rooted in Black feminist thought, and this kind of the experience, using it to analyze the experiences of marginalized groups. But here I kind of try to use it to study the experiences of very privileged white men. So that might be a bit problematic, definitely. And the other issue and this is linked, that there were very few kind of very explicit references in the narratives of these men to kind of social categories. Like they didn't talk about themselves as, kind of white men, but they're talked about themselves more as kind of more universal human beings. So like how to deal with this was kind of difficult. And so kind of what I did with that first issue, how I thought it through was, kind of taking this approach that intersectionality is a critical inquiry praxis, And really, I wanted to have this commitment to social justice and to challenge inequalities. And I thought that, studying even privileged groups or privileged men in particular can, in a way, support intersectional feminist commitments, because I really critically examined their privilege throughout the book. And although there were very few kind of explicit references to race and whiteness, I tried to analyze their narratives in context and kind of bring it in kind of through this. So still, although these categories were kind of absent or silenced, wherever I thought that it is relevant, I pointed that out, basically asking this question, how does their privileged social position shape and facilitate their veganism? That was kind of guiding me throughout the book, I guess. And I think also that marginalization and privilege are interlinked. They are different sides of the same coin of structural inequality. And so if we study the privileged or unmarked groups, then we can also understand better marginalization and conditions that create structural inequalities. So I think we can, in a way, use intersectionality to study also privilege and privileged groups. And then the other issue that, what to do if we've got these narratives and we kind of want to use an intersectional approach, but we don't really have kind of very explicit references to social categories there. And as one kind of solution, I already pointed out that we have to kind of examine these narratives in context, that we always do in a way, but so kind of thinking, how does this context, shape this situation that they really speak of themselves as more universal human beings in a way. And one thing is that kind of this absence of these references to social categories can itself be an indication of privilege. And this is also kind of an approach that I took. It's kind of sometimes difficult to decide what categories to focus on in your analysis, but and it's also, you can't have like an endless number of intersections you'd have to choose. And so in this work, I focused mainly on gender and race and other categories where perhaps maybe sidelined. Class as well was actually important. So so that is always difficult to figure out what to focus on. But yeah, in some contexts, some maybe stand out as more important. Right. So I feel like maybe I didn't explain that one really well, but maybe we can talk about that when there's time for questions. And I actually don't know how much time I have because I failed to start my timer. But yeah, so this is pretty much, I'm coming to the end too. And this is something I didn't kind of focus on in my work, at least in this work, but and this has been mentioned in previous presentations, but I think it's something important when we think of, intersectionality and how to use it as a methodology, as a method, and how to bring in animals actually. So there's been some work that has focused on that, but it's kind of under-theorized, and I think we could do more in this area. But there's been sort of recommendations, how we can think of that, and some of those, for instance, include like how, for instance, studying how human beings organize humans into kind of categories, interspecies categories, for instance, by sex, breed, age, other categories. So that is kind of interesting. And then kind of how animals themselves categorize and kind of have some interspecies power relations that could be studied, and how kind of animals relate to different human beings differently. So there's a kind of some ways in which we can start thinking about how to include animals in intersectional frameworks. And then, yeah, finally, I found a very interesting work, actually, just I wanted to mention. I haven't used that really in my work, but how actually they can be like, we can think of how non-human animals can have gender. So this, yeah, and this work actually challenges the gender and sex distinction as well. But yeah, they kind of were arguing that some non-human animals can have gender as well, and it's kind of very interesting and a bit complex, but yeah, very interesting work. And yeah, finally, I just wanted to maybe advertise this new book that is coming out. It's an edited volume that we did with colleagues, Kuura Irni and Milla-Maria Joki at the University of Helsinki, where I did my postdoc. And so this is Feminist Animal and Multi-Species Studies. And in this book, we particularly focus on food and eating. And why I mention this is actually that some of those questions that I raised here we are also discussed in this book. So it's very much kind of like trying to take an intersectional approach. Yeah, but I will stop here because I have no idea how much time I used. So just in case. So thank you.